Rick Grimes woke up alone in a city that had already died screaming. Atlanta's fall was loud, violent, and fully planned for the screen. Yet, The Walking Dead chose to let him wake into silence instead, hiding the noise so we'd only ever feel the aftermath. That choice was the first of many, and it raises a question about what the show kept deciding we shouldn't survive watching. The fall of Atlanta, Rick Grimes rides a horse into Atlanta and finds a tank sitting dead in the middle of the street, and the show never tells you how it got there. That is not a gap in the story. That is a choice. The Walking Dead had an entire flashback ready to go, a full prologue showing the exact moment the city fell, and it cut it before a single viewer ever saw it. The plan was simple on paper. Open Season 2's premiere with Atlanta still standing, still fighting, before jumping back to Rick, waking up alone in that hospital bed. Barricades going up, evacuation routes jammed, soldiers trying to hold intersections with heavy armor and losing anyway. Wide aerial shots of the city burning, reportedly sketched out in concept art, meant to connect the world Rick lost to the one he wakes up into. That timeline detail matters more than it sounds. The prologue would have confirmed Atlanta went down early, not gradually, with tanks getting overrun at street level before the outbreak had even finished making the news. Rick doesn't just wake up into a ruined city. He wakes up into a city that fell fast while he was unconscious and completely unable to help anyone, including his own family. And that's the part the finished show only ever implies. You get the tank, you get the empty streets, you get a man on a horse riding past evidence of a battle he never got to witness, let alone fight in. The scene got cut for the most boring reason imaginable. It ran the premiere long, and producers wanted viewers on that highway with the traffic jam, and the first real Walker threat faster than a flashback would allow. Pure pacing. Nothing sinister, nothing about squeamishness over gore, but look at what that decision actually trained the show to do. From episode 1, The Walking Dead decided the collapse itself was less interesting than what came after it. Silence over spectacle, aftermath over event. It built its entire identity on wandering through consequences instead of showing you the moment those consequences got created, and that instinct never really left the show again. Some fans still argue this is the biggest miss in the whole series. A mythic scene that never got to exist. The one time we could have watched civilization actually die instead of just finding its corpse. Maybe. The evidence is thin, more inference than confirmed footage. But the instinct behind cutting it, that part became a pattern. Because hiding the fall of a whole city is one thing. It's much colder when the group already found one small pocket of people who were doing everything right. And the show quietly decided we didn't need to know what happened to them. The Vados Massacre. The one group in this entire show that chose kindness over survival got wiped out, and the show made sure you never saw it happen. Remember the guys guarding the nursing home? The ones everyone assumed were a gang running some kind of grift. That twist landed hard back in season 1. A group of supposed thugs turned out to be running a makeshift retirement home in the middle of a zombie apocalypse, feeding elderly residents who could not fend for themselves. Then the show just let them vanish. No death, no goodbye, no explanation. For years, fans wondered if the Vados made it out there somewhere, still holding the line. They did not. A deleted Season 2 premiere storyline answers the question the broadcast version never had the guts to ask. Rick's group was supposed to swing back by the nursing home, and what they find there closes the book permanently. The facility is empty. Blood everywhere. Walkers' wandering rooms that used to hold wheelchairs and medicine carts, corpses scattered in the wreckage of whatever defense the Vados tried to mount. The scene never spells out a clean cause. Either raiders hit them or their own perimeter finally failed. And honestly, the ambiguity makes it worse. It means there was no single villain to blame, just the apocalypse doing what it always does eventually. This is not a random cut subplot. This is the show quietly confirming that decency lost. The Vados were the exception, a group that spent their limited resources protecting people who could not produce, fight, or run. In a story that constantly argues humanity is the real monster, they were the rebuttal. Cutting their deaths off screen did not save the audience from tragedy. It saved the moment where hope had a body count. The reasoning for the cut is almost insulting in how practical it sounds. Showrunners felt revisiting a season 1 side story would drag focus away from the highway and the search for Sophia, so a fully written massacre got shelved in favor of momentum. Somewhere in a script file, actual pages exist describing bloody hallways and dead compassion, and the show decided that was less important than pacing. Think about what that means for Rick specifically. A man already losing his grip one funeral at a time. He never gets to grieve the Vados, because he is never shown they are gone. The show keeps stripping him of people without letting him process the loss, and here it did not even bother giving him the chance to know. The Green Farm taught the show it could hide a dead body in a barn and call it hope. This taught it something even more useful. It could just delete the funeral entirely and let the audience assume everyone lived. But hiding a death is one thing. What happens when the thing lying to survivors is not silence? It is a voice, actively telling people that somewhere out there, safety is still real. Dale's radio argument. A man on the radio told a dying world exactly what it wanted to hear, and Dale was the only one who called it a lie. That's not even the strange part. The strange part is the show wrote the whole scene and then decided nobody should ever see it. In the deleted footage from Save the Last One, the group picks up a preacher working a frequency, promising them meaning in the middle of the apocalypse. Dale doesn't just listen and nod along like everyone else, he argues back, pushing on the accuracy of what's being said and the ethics of saying it at all to people who have nothing left to lose. His objection wasn't paranoia for its own sake. Dale had already spent an entire season watching authority fail on camera, over and over, in ways that got people killed. So when a voice on a frequency claimed the collapse of civilization was some kind of divine punishment, he heard exactly what it was. That's the kind of comfort that gets people killed in a different way, just slower. The preacher framed the outbreak as judgment, sin finally catching up with a species that had it coming. Dale picked the claim apart in real time, refusing to let a total stranger turn mass death into a sermon. This wasn't some soft debate about hope versus despair. It was a man drawing a hard line, delivered by the one member of the group willing to say a story doesn't get to go unchallenged just because it shows up wrapped in scripture. That's the detail that makes this cut actually sting. The exchange would have confirmed something the show never said outright, that surviving broadcasters weren't just spreading bad information, they were spreading bad meaning, handing dying people a tidy explanation for their own suffering. Every single person who believed that voice on the radio was a person trading grief for a story that let them stop asking harder questions. Producers cut it because season 2 needed all its oxygen for Shane, for the slow unraveling that was eating him alive from the inside out. A subplot about a preacher weaponizing the apocalypse over the airwaves was a thread they had zero intention of pulling on long term. Great. Add it to the pile of scenes that never got their moment. Fans who've dug through the surviving script material read this scene as the moment Dale's whole function in the group should have become official text instead of subtext, the conscience who checks the group's optimism against reality. It also would have cracked open the illusion that the farm was its own sealed little world, connecting the isolated Georgia backroads to a wider, still broadcasting, still preaching civilization out there somewhere. That read holds up. It just never made it to air. So the group already survived one liar with a signal and a story. Somebody argued with him, out loud, on the record, and won. But it's always easier to argue with a stranger's lie than the one your own grief tells you in private, because the most dangerous false comfort in this whole series wasn't broadcast on any radio. It was standing right in front of a man who couldn't tell if she was really there. The Walker-Lori hallucination. Rick Grimes almost saw his dead wife's face rot in front of him, and the show pulled back at the last second. By home, Rick is already a man talking to a phone that never rings anyone real. Already a man who sees Lori standing in doorways that lead nowhere. The visions we got are quiet, sad, disorienting, but quiet. She shows up in a yellow dress. She says something gentle, she disappears. It plays like grief. What almost got filmed plays like a threat. Reportedly, an early version of one hallucination pushed Rick's breakdown somewhere much uglier. Lori appears at a distance, same as always. Same soft, familiar shape. Rick moves toward her the way he always does in these visions, chasing a version of his wife that only exists in his head. Then, she gets closer. The eyes cloud over. The walk turns wrong, stiff, hungry. For 1 second, the woman Rick loved and the thing Rick has been killing all season are the exact same image, before he snaps out of it, and she's just gone. Nothing in the finished cut confirms every visual beat of that description, so take the specifics as the strongest reconstruction available, not a leaked shot list. But the instinct behind it lines up with something the show considered elsewhere the same season. A separate, deleted idea had Sophia shot twice in that barn scene, once as a walker, once still human, before producers landed on the version that aired. Same worry both times. Once you let the audience watch a loved one turn monstrous, even in someone's head, you risk making them doubt what's real and what's just Rick's mind collapsing in on itself. That's the real reason this got cut. Not squeamishness about gore. Rick had already put a bullet in walkers wearing familiar faces. The problem was clarity. Editors decided the phone and the apparition already sold is unraveling, and stacking a monstrous Laurie on top of that risked burying a quiet performance under a horror movie jump scare. But sit with what that image was actually going to say. If Laurie's rotted face had flickered onto her living one for even a second, it would have meant Rick's grief and Rick's nightmares had stopped being two separate things. The man who once begged Shane to just get his family somewhere safe would have been shown plainly, unable to tell the difference between the woman he lost and the thing he now kills on instinct. That's not a jump scare, that's a diagnosis. So the show gave Rick a ghost instead of a monster, and told itself that was the kinder cut. It wasn't protecting Laurie's memory, it was protecting Rick's mind from a mirror that showed exactly what surviving had done to it. The show would flinch to protect a grieving man's mind. But its hardest line wasn't about what a survivor imagined, it was about what the camera was allowed to actually show happening to a child. Lizzie's Uncensored Death. This is a show that let you watch a man's skull cave in under a bowling ball, that let intestines drag across the pavement like party streamers, and somehow the one shot it couldn't stomach was a bullet hitting a little girl. That's the line. That's the exact spot where the whole series flinched. The Grove ends with Carol walking a 9-year-old into a flower field and raising a gun, because Lizzie had already smothered her own sister Mika, and calmly explained she'd help Judith become a walker too. The show earns this moment completely. It builds the horror for an entire episode, and then, right as Carol pulls the trigger, the camera cuts away. You hear the shot, you never see it land. A version showing the impact was reportedly put together, at least on paper, close enough to production that it factored into real conversations about what this show could air. Not a walker headshot, not a soldier gunned down at a prison gate, a child killed by an adult who loved her, shown at the actual moment of death. Network standards treated that as a different category entirely, one where the usual rules about gore stopped applying the second the victim was a kid. Compare that to what survived the edit. Baby corpses turned biters, a man's face torn off by teeth, entire families reduced to Walker Chow across 4 seasons without a single flinch from the camera. The show had zero problem showing you a corpse getting its throat slit for a snack, but showing Carol's bullet actually connect was where somebody in a boardroom said, absolutely not. Nothing in the released footage confirms exactly why that cutaway survived over the alternative, but follow what the pattern already told you 2 entries ago. If the Walker version of Laurie existed to protect Rick from watching what he'd lost, this cut exists to protect the audience from watching what Carol had to become. Either the camera stays off Lizzie to keep the moment about Carol's grief instead of a child's death, or it's simply too much violence for anyone to sit through and call entertainment. Both readings land on the same wall the writers built and refuse to knock down. Carol pulls that trigger and carries every ounce of what happens next. The guilt, the silence, the years she never fully speaks of it again, while the audience gets spared the one image that would make her cost impossible to look away from. So the show refuses to let us watch hope die on screen. But it's just as careful about the opposite, because the cruelest thing it ever did was let us imagine a warm, living future in full, then cut it down to almost nothing before we could get comfortable. The extended dinner dream. Every other cut in this show flinched away from pain. This one flinches away from happiness, and that should terrify you more. In the day will come when you won't be, Rick closes his eyes and gets a dinner. The whole group, alive, sitting around a table like the last 7 years never happened. It lasts seconds. Then he opens his eyes and he's back on his knees in front of a killer with a bat. The version that got cut was longer, not by much, but enough. More dialogue, more teasing, hints of plans for a future the group was never going to get, dropped casually around a table that never existed anywhere except inside a grieving man's skull. Editors trimmed it down to a flicker because the episode was already carrying 2 brutal deaths, and they were worried a longer, warmer dream would tip the whole thing into something that felt manipulative instead of devastating. Think about what that actually means. This is a show that let you sit in a barn and watch a boy explode. This is a show that made you listen to a man's skull cave in one bat swing at a time. And the one thing it decided was too much to fully show you was a family enjoying dinner together. That is not a pacing note. That is a confession. The dinner was never meant to be a real future. It was a could have been, a timeline that closed the second Negan swung, and the extended cut apparently leaned into that harder, with quiet domestic beats this show almost never bothers to show you, because this show doesn't usually believe its characters get to be domestic. A fuller version of that piece, played out in real time, would have hung over Negan's entire reign like a bruise that never faded. Some fans think that's exactly why it should have stayed in. Others think an episode already built to break. You didn't need one more hammer. Rick Grimes wakes up alone in this story. He loses people in waves. He never gets time to grieve. And here, for a handful of seconds, the show hands him the one thing it never lets him keep, a table full of people who are still breathing, and then it snatches even the memory of that table half away before you can finish setting it. The show spent 5 cuts protecting you from watching horror become human. This is the first time it protected you from watching hope become human instead, because a fully lived version of that piece would have made everything after it unbearable. A dream can be cut without consequence, but there's a deleted conversation fans treat like scripture, one where the show supposedly came within inches of rewriting what the future was even for, spoken between a killer and the boy who was meant to inherit the world. Carl's missing Negan conversation. This is the deleted scene fans want to be real more than almost any other, because if it exists, it fixes the ending. Somewhere in the writer's room, during the back half of Season 7, there was reportedly a version of the Savior War that let Carl and Negan actually talk, not threaten, not posture through offense. Talk. The setting was the stretch of story around the first day of the rest of your life, the finale where Rick finally turns on Negan for good. In the cut version, Carl gets in the room first, and he doesn't waste it on hate. The pitch is that Negan lays out the actual logic behind his rule, not just the bat and the lineup, but the argument for why a violent hierarchy keeps more people alive than it kills. And Carl pushes back on the morality of it. Kill for order, coerce for peace, the whole rotten trade. That argument alone would have been worth the runtime, but the bigger claim is what Carl does with it. He doesn't just condemn Negan. He reportedly starts describing what he'd build instead, a version of civilization that survives without a bat named Lucille doing the talking. Nothing in the released show ever lets Carl make that case out loud, so treat this next part as a leap, not a fact. If the scene played the way it's described, it would have turned Negan and Carl into ideological foils instead of executioner and victim. One boy's entire future philosophy spoken directly to the man who represents its opposite. That is a massive rewrite of their dynamic, and it is worth saying plainly that a lot of the specific detail traces back to a joke breakdown video built for April Fools, one that blends real production history with invented lore for laughs. So the confidence here has to stay labeled. What isn't in dispute is the pattern. The dinner table dream we already tore apart let the show feel hope for 30 seconds before yanking it back. This is worse. This is hope as an actual argument, spoken by the one character built to carry it, and the show reportedly couldn't let him finish the sentence. The official reasoning points to lore risk, giving Negan too much philosophical ground, complicating beats the writers weren't ready to pay off. Some versions say it got pulled close enough to air that the shape of it still lingers in outlines and unused pages. A kid who spent seasons watching everyone he loved get carved down to nothing was, in this account, about to tell his father's worst enemy exactly what the world was supposed to look like when the killing stopped, and the show blinked. Because if that conversation is real, Carl's entire "this is for the world we build" arc was resting on a scene nobody ever aired, which means the audience was asked to believe in a future Carl never got to argue for out loud. And that's the pattern coming due. Because if the show spent years quietly cutting every moment that made the future feel real, then the last question is what it did to the future itself, right at the very end, when it finally had to show us how the story turned out, the alternate flash forward. The finale almost showed you a finished world, and then it deliberately, pointedly, didn't. Somewhere in development, Rest in Peace carried a version of its closing time jump that reportedly pushed 11 years out instead of just a few, not a quiet epilogue, a whole new generation. Older versions of the surviving kids, a more seasoned set of leaders, schools, and infrastructure, and the kind of long-term planning that only exists once people stop just surviving and start actually living. That's not a coda, that's a civilization, fully built and fully standing. And the show said no. Part of that was practical. An 11-year jump locks the future in place, and spin-offs like The Ones Who Live needed room to breathe immediately after the credits rolled. You can't build new stories in a future that's already been fully furnished, decorated, and moved into. But the scheduling excuse is only half of it, and it's the smaller half by a wide margin. Think about everything this video just walked you through. A city's fall that got cut down to whispers, a massacre reduced to a rumor, a wife turned walker, erased so grief could stay clean, a child's death rewritten so the show wouldn't have to sit in it, a warm dinner scene trimmed because comfort read as a threat to the tone, Carl handing Rick an entire philosophy for the future, deleted because the show wasn't ready to let him say it out loud. Every single one of those cuts was the same flinch over and over again. Show less of the cost, show less of the hope. Never let either one get too real. An 11-year flash forward breaks that pattern completely. completely, and not in the direction you'd expect. It doesn't add horror, it adds proof. Proof that the suffering was worth it. Proof that Rick's missing years and Judith's stolen childhood and every Walker Lori and every Cut massacre all led somewhere clean and rebuilt and thriving. And that's exactly the promise the show refused to make, right up until the very end. Because if you show a near civilization, you've turned survival into a guarantee. You've told the audience that the apocalypse pays off on schedule, like clockwork, like it was always going to work out. The actual finale gives you something smaller and stranger than that. A steadier Commonwealth, an older Judith, a world that's better, but still cracked, still unproven, still fully capable of falling apart tomorrow. That's not a smaller ending because the writers ran out of ambition. It's smaller because bigger would have lied to you. And this show spent 11 seasons refusing to lie about how hard any of this actually was. The show never cut these scenes to spare you the gore. It cut them to protect the one thing it needed you to believe walking out the door, that survival was worth it, without ever promising you it was finished. Rick Grimes never got a completed world. He got an unproven one, which is the only kind of ending that could mean anything at all. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.